Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining Derek's live chat show. Today I've got a very exciting guest, Dr. Lynda Shaw, who I've known for a number of years. We've both spoken on the same platform at a financial advisors conference. We followed each other and we've shared all sorts of tips and knowledge. Lynda's going to be the next president of the Professional Speaking Association in the UK and Ireland, which is a fantastic honour. Well, it was an honour for me anyway. I rushed around doing it for over a year and lots of things after that. Let me just tell you about Dr. Lynda Shaw. Lynda started her career as an air hostess, I think for British Airways or somebody like that. Had a couple of children, ran a gym which employed 20 people and with 2,000 members, which was fantastic. Then the recession came and all sorts of things that happened. And Lynda, as a mature student, went to university for 9 years to become a neuroscientist. So there's hope for all of us to go to university for 9 years and study even now. Lynda, thank you so much for joining us. It's a great pleasure to have you on.
Thank you very much, Derek.
Lynda, the first question is, what is neuroscience?
Well, I studied cognitive neuroscience, and that means we study how the brain changes behavior and behavior changes the brain. So it's all to do with how I approach it. It's all to do with us being in more control of our behavior and in more control of our brain. And we can actually rewire our brain far more easily than we think, and therefore lead a better life and be more effective and more efficient and all of those things. So that's it. So we look at, in my studies, I use an fMRI scanning machine, and I gave people these images of extreme emotion, either very unpleasant or very pleasant, and they were lying in the scanner, and I was detecting what was happening in their brain by the images that we could see when they looked at certain images. But the key was those images were shown below conscious awareness. So I was looking at unconscious processing of emotion. So that's what I did.
Well, that sounds fascinating and scary at the same time, actually. It really does. Why did you go into the subject after all those other things that you did?
Well, ever since I was 14, I've been reading about consciousness. It's a fascinating subject. It's like the last frontier in our knowledge base. Consciousness, and it's really, really a tough topic to talk about. And then once I had the health club, and I had, actually that was my third business. It was my biggest business. I had 2 other businesses before that. And then I made babies, and I carried on working part-time. And then I realized once my daughter got to be about 9 and my son 6, I decided to take myself off to night school to do an A-level, because I always thought I wasn't very bright and that I wasn't academic in any shape or form. So I thought I'd just try this out. And I thought, oh, I remember studying. It's not so bad after all. So I decided I would carry on, and I applied to go to university to study. So I wanted to study social anthropology, because I wanted to know why people do what they do, what happens if Tesco's comes to a village, or what happens when they build a dam in Nepal. You know, I really wanted to understand that stuff. And I'm also a travel junkie, or I was, until we were stopped being allowed to get on aeroplanes. But they made me study a second topic with it, a joint honours degree. So I went for psychology by default. And then halfway through the course, the psychology became easier and the social anthropology became harder, because social anthropology is about life. I mean, how big a topic can you get, about life? It's huge. And I'm a yes, but what if person. So my 2,000 word essay would turn into 20,000 words, and I would get myself into terrible trouble. So then I got my degree, and then I decided to do a master's in psychology. And when I chose my supervisor, I looked at his biography on the university website, and he was a neurophysicist of vision, Cambridge graduate, really, really bright. And I looked at all these things that he was an expert in, and then at the very bottom said consciousness. And I thought, oh no, I'm now excited. So I went up to Mike and I said, I see you're an expert in consciousness as well. I didn't realize. I said, but would you be interested in supervising me in a PhD for unconscious processing? And he jumped at the chance. He said yes. So in actual fact, I came in through the back door. very much so. It sort of evolved. You know, I had no idea when I went to night school that I was going to university. And when I got to university for my first degree, I had no idea I was going to do a master's. And then I did the master's, I had no idea I was going to do a PhD. It sort of just unfolded. And I studied full time for 9 years. So that's how I got into it, really, out of having been a businesswoman and then thinking I wasn't at all academic and not very bright, and then discovering that I wasn't too bad after all.
So you thought you weren't very bright, and look where you've ended up. Now that all links to self-talk, doesn't it? You know, if we think we can, we're probably right, and if we think we can't, we're probably right. Wasn't it Thomas Edison that said that, or somebody like that? Or I'm sure this quote's been stolen, but that's fantastic. So what you're saying is, clearly, if we believe we can, anybody can do anything, and that comes back to one of my subjects, NLP. But you know, if you model what other people do, then you can do it yourself if you're determined enough. Wow, that's fantastic.
It does depend, doesn't it? If you're a 6'4", 25 stone lorry driver, you probably are not going to become a ballet dancer, and if you were, you probably wouldn't be that good. So I think we can. We have some limitations, but we are actually in more control, and we can change of our lives more than we realize we can once we understand how the brain works. So that's what drives me. What drives me is to show people that they actually are in control of their lives to a certain extent. Not completely, and never not completely. And you don't want to be completely. You don't want to be completely, because if you were in control of your brain all the time, you wouldn't have a survival instinct for fight or flight. And so we need those things. If you have depression, anxiety disorder, or another mental health problem, then being in control of your brain is not. It's different, a totally different subject. But mainstream, normal-ish life, we are in more control than we think, and we can certainly do more than we think we can if we want to enough. That's what it is. You just got to want to enough.
Down to the motivation. Now, earlier you said you studied emotions when people were unconscious. Is that?
No, they were unconscious.
I got that wrong, didn't I? As usual.
That would have been really fascinating, Derek, but I think the ethics committee might have been a bit upset.
Oh, okay. See, I was thinking that was linking to dreaming, and you were studying dreaming, because I'm fascinated by dreaming.
Oh, no, that was actually going to be part of my studies, is studying dreaming. But it's very difficult, because you either need to put people in a sleep laboratory, which is very unnatural. So you're not quite sure whether the dreams they would have had they not been in a dream lab, or they're at home, and then you ring them and you disturb their sleep, and you record what their answers are to your questions whilst they're still very drowsy about the dreams they had. But then again, that's quite an unnatural thing too. So it's very difficult to study dreams, but I'm sure that's been improved upon since I got my doctorate. But no, what I did was there are 800 images which were collated by something called the IAPS, the International Affective Picture System, and psychologists around the world have measured them and labelled them in terms of how nasty or nice they are in terms of valence and arousal. And those set of images are what the psychologists around the world use now, so that we can compare fairly our research. So if I'm studying something with the particular set of images, and somebody across into North America or somewhere is studying the same set of images, we can compare our results more easily. So that's what I used. And basically, if you show an image to somebody and then put a control image at the front and behind that image, so you're masking it, back and front, forward masking, you've interrupted the brain working out what that image is that they've seen. I also put these images up for 10 milliseconds, although the refresh time on the computer was probably 17 milliseconds. So between the masking and how quickly I presented the images, the participants were actually looking at the screen, but they didn't see anything. They weren't aware of anything they were looking at. They thought they were looking at nothing. So the bits of the brain that were lighting up show that in actual fact we do very much process emotion below conscious awareness. That's what it was about.
Now, when we spoke together, I remember you brought a brain along so everyone could understand bits of it. Have you got your brain with you? What's it called, Freddie? Or something?
Earlier, going down. I go. There's my brain. I didn't actually make it. You can probably tell because it's plastic. There you go. There's the brain. I have two of these. I call one andro and one androgynous, which I try to make them gender neutral, as we should do.
As we should do all the time.
And out of this skull, or out of this head, comes the brain.
Right.
How cool is that?
That's a big one. That must be your brain. That's a very big one. Some of us haven't got such big brains. Are they all the same size?
Derek, let me tell you in secret, size doesn't matter.
Thank you for that, Lynda.
No, it depends. I believe Einstein's brain was quite small. But of course everything's packed tightly, so you can't tell by the size of the intelligence or anything like that. And female brains tend to, or the stereotypical female brain tends to be a little bit smaller than a stereotypical male brain. But talking about gender differences in the brain is never a good idea.
No, you can do that, but I probably can't. But can I ask you, just off the record, does that mean men are cleverer than women?
That's what I mean. You see, size doesn't matter. You just fell into it.
I knew you'd say that. I knew you'd say that. Very good. Which bits of those brains, just while you've got it there, if somebody has a stroke or something happens, what actually happens in the brain, Lynda?
Well, basically a stroke means that you have not enough blood or you have too much blood in the brain. So you have a cerebral bleed with too much blood, or the nutrients are deprived because of a block going up, particularly in the neck, up into the brain. So a stroke can affect a little bit of the brain or a lot of the brain, depending on the extent of the bleed or extent of the deprivation of any nutrients. So it does very much depend on the lesion that's caused the issue. But there's plenty. I worked in an NHS hospital for about, I think it was about 6 months. And I worked in a rehab unit for people with closed head injuries from strokes or motorbike accidents or horse riding accidents and the like. And actually the clinical psychologists and the speech therapists and the physios as well, the whole team helped the patients enormously, and a lot made a really good recovery, but of course some didn't. But yeah, it does depend.
And you can tell which part of the brain works our memory. Why do we wake up sometimes in the morning thinking about something that happened 20 or 30 years ago?
Memory is a really complicated topic, really, really complicated. But when you first wake up in the morning, you know that when you're half asleep and half awake, you're sort of that scrummy feeling of the duvet, you've snuggled down and you're sort of drifting in and out. The brain is then in what we call alpha frequency. And alpha frequency, electrical frequency, is when we are the most creative we can be. It's like a light meditation state. And when we are in that creative state, all sorts of answers come to us. Oh, it's a really good idea to have a notepad by your bed to make a note of those things. It's like a daydreaming sort of state. So you can actually put your brain in that state throughout the day if you wish, but it's a natural place when you first wake up. So if you're just coming out of sleep and you maybe think of something 20, 30 years ago or something like that, it might have been that you were dreaming it. But you've forgotten the dream already. It might be that you have an issue that has been bubbling away, incubating, and all of a sudden you're waking up in the morning and you've just realised, crumbs, I had the answer to that 20 years ago and I hadn't put 2 and 2 together. That's when the brain's in alpha. That's when we get these aha moments, these sort of little mini epiphanies. Maybe what happened.
And we have to write them down, don't we? Because they disappear very quickly, don't they? Those moments.
Yeah, they decays very quickly. But honestly, if I make a note of how I basically I didn't used to get up very quickly in the morning because I used to have low blood pressure. I don't now, so I would get dizzy. So I made myself stay in bed until I woke up properly, and then I could stand up. But what I found was that, I was curing world famine. I had answers to nuclear disarmament. Well, okay, major exaggerations, but I was having really amazing thoughts to answers to questions, answers to questions rather. Just by that lovely alpha state. So it's one to think about and maybe explore yourselves.
Do you think beer causes alpha state? I get creative ideas after I've had 2 or 3 pints. That's no. A no, is it?
No.
Okay.
No.
Okay, that doesn't work then.
That's probably Dutch courage and being too brave.
Yeah. Okay. So what can we learn from this, the people on the call and also people watching this? How can we use this as lay people?
If you can just learn a little bit about your brain, you are honestly more in the driving seat of your destiny. You really are. You don't need to learn a lot about it, but you do. I mean, if you learn a little bit about how to change habits, for instance, habits that no longer serve us, that's a really good thing to do. If you learn that if you put your brain in this light meditative state, which is alpha frequency, then actually you're more creative. You come up with answers that you didn't know were bubbling away there. There's an awful lot of things we can do. And the other thing is that the reason we can do so much more with our brain than we believe is about the neuroplasticity of the brain. Our brain changes depending on our behavior. So we now know the rewiring of the brain is absolutely fantastic. It's phenomenal. So we can actually change that. We can choose how we want to wire our brain. And I think that's so cool, just really cool.
So if we think positively or negatively, that's what we get, and it does seem to make a difference to the attitude of people and how they come across, etc. Is that where you're going with this, or is that too simple?
Almost where I'm going with it. We must remember that excuse me, all emotion is valuable, all of them. Every single emotion we feel is valuable and it's not bad. What isn't very good is if we are experiencing a negative emotion, fear, anger, anxiety, all of that, is what's not good is if we hold on to it for too long. Now, don't get me wrong, emotions are fleeting. They zap in and out of our brains all of the time. They're constantly changing. But sometimes the feeling remains from one particular emotion that we felt. If we then have that emotion, it's an internal representation of that emotion is then how we are feeling, and we hold on to that feeling, even if it's for 3 days, 4 days, it turns into a mood. We would have had experienced in that time lots of other emotions too, but we're holding on to that really not useful feeling. And if we're holding on to that no longer useful feeling, then that is actually a waste of time, and it can put us in a very stressful situation. It can, especially if it's one of fear or anxiety or anger, and if we put ourselves in a stressful situation for very long, those stress hormones will rage around the system in a chronic level, which can lead to high blood pressure. It can even lead to some cancers. So it's a really good idea not to allow ourselves to hold on to negative feelings from these emotions for too long, so that we're in control of the stress hormones, which means that we are healthier.
Well, that's giving us a lot to think about. I've got about 150 questions to that, but we're not going to have time for them. I've got a question in the chat box, and everybody else, don't forget to put questions in the chat box. Ryan says, fascinating stuff, Dr. Shaw. Could you please explain a little bit about how exercise or the loss of a loved one affects the brain?
Oh, indeed. Well, first of all, let's take bereavement. Bereavement, as we all know, goes through several stages. Off the top of my head, I can't remember the actual order they're supposed to go in, but I do believe those stages are not always all felt. I do believe that they can be in different order, but of course the first feeling we will get is shock, and then denial, and then anger. And all of those things, all of those emotions we will feel with bereavement, especially of somebody very close to us. And there is nothing anyone can do to help you apart from listen and be there for you when you want to talk. Some people, my aunt and uncle lost their son who was 8 years old, and my uncle couldn't talk about it. My aunt wanted to talk about it all the time. We all handle these things differently. If we're a friend or another loved one of that person who's grieving, the thing to do is be there for them, regardless of what they want to talk about, if they want to talk about it, whether they've had a shower, whether they can get up out of the morning, it doesn't matter. Just be there for them and learn how to listen properly, because their brain will be in a complete state of overwhelm with all of the emotions that are going on and a high level of stress, which means that all of those hormones will be raging around the system, which means that cortisol, for instance, will control and dampen down serotonin, which is the happy chappy, which is all about eating, mood, sleep. So we don't sleep properly, we eat too much, we don't eat enough, and all of those things. Also suppresses dopamine, which is about reward and motivation and anticipation of reward, which means that we won't want to do anything. We just want to stare out of the window. We won't want to join society at all if we're really grieving that much. So there's an awful lot that goes on in the brain when it comes to bereavement. What was the other?
I'll come to that in a minute. You, by the way, you repeated the Elisabeth KublerRoss work very well there. I don't think you got the fourth and fifth ones, but we have talked about that on the chat show before, about the work of Elisabeth KublerRoss, which is when there's change or shock or denial or someone passes away. And if anyone's interested, if they Google Elisabeth KublerRoss, it'll explain it in some depth. And also when people get made redundant and the sort of changes that might come out of the lockdown. So I just wanted to mention that. Can I come to, I just wanted to throw one thing. Why couldn't my dad or most dads talk about what happened to them during the war, during the Second World War? In fact, the only time I got him to talk about it was when I'd given him 4 pints down a pub just before he passed away. I find that, was that shock?
No, I don't. Well, there would have been shock in there. My dad was exactly the same, Derek. He wouldn't talk about the Second World War either. I think there's a lot goes on, and I think it depends on the individuals. For my father, for instance, I know that he went into the Second World War as high C of E lad, and he came out completely not believing in anything and thought that war just made you cannon fodder. Mm. And he had no time to glorify it. He had no wish to glorify it or talk about it. So he was totally disillusioned and clearly very upset on many levels of what he witnessed. But so I think there was a maybe a feeling that it wasn't to be glorified. So therefore he wasn't going to talk about it. He didn't want to be a hero. You know, he wasn't a hero in the copybook sense of the word, but he didn't want to be seen as putting too much of his life associated with such devastating times. And perhaps he was. This is my opinion about my father.
I think the brain shuts down some of those dreadful memories. But anyway, I was wondering what your take on it was. The second question from Ryan is, Derek, myself and Paul, who's on this call, have worked pretty closely with Ryan over a number of years. In fact, he's been one of our best students, probably our only student actually. But he said we told him to carry a notepad and put it by his bed, where you get your best ideas, and that's presumably alpha state, what you've already talked about.
That's right. That's when the brain is in alpha frequency. Yeah, definitely. Really good trick.
Yeah.
He's got his hand up, Derek.
Tony's got his hand up. I'm just going to finish the one thing, Tony, and I'll come back to you. Paul says, have you read Sway about unconscious bias? We make very quick unconscious judgments about things. What's your view on that? Then I'll come to Tony.
Yeah, well, unconscious bias are part of the heuristic system or systems in the brain. Basically, there is so much for us to do at any one time. The brain has to put as much as it can in unconscious processing because our attention is very, very tiny. So only what we attend to is our conscious processing. The rest is all unconscious processing. So the brain will put information into unconscious processing quickly. That's a heuristic. But there is a trade-off, because what the brain will do, it will go, right, that animal has got 4 legs, a tail, and 2 ears, so it must be a dog. Oh, so put that one in a dog. Although that one's a cat. So we start labeling things, including people. And because it's a quick way, it's not unkind, every brain does it. Let me promise you that, I promise you this, if you don't have unconscious bias, you're dead. All right, we've all got them. It does not make us bad people. It makes us human beings. So our brain does all of this for speed, but the side effect is that we show biases because we have labeled people in these little boxes for speed of processing. Now, if you have companies are trying very hard to overcome this, especially the larger ones, and they have been for a few years now, but it's really difficult. Unconscious bias, for instance, I don't know what your political views are, but at the moment, people are pretty cheesed off with Boris Johnson. So therefore, we are now going to be looking for ways to confirm our thinking and ignoring anything that disagrees with us. That's confirmation bias. We're looking to confirm our biases and ignoring the other information. Now, if you do that, and you, for instance, whatever you're doing, if you're working, if you're not working, whatever you're doing, that can be an issue because you could be losing and missing really valuable input.
Sure.
And equally, of course, if you are dealing with people of different colour, different religion, different sexual orientation, all of those things, then we start showing prejudice, and that's not acceptable either. So, biases are really, really difficult to handle. When I work with companies talking about biases, unconscious biases, I say things like, okay, if you're on an interview panel, how about you all agree, and everybody has to agree, you all agree that if one of you is showing some kind of bias, you actually point it out to them so that you become aware of it. Awareness is really, really important. But I have to say, there is only so much we can do with behaviour, with biases. The rest of the thing, what needs to be mopped up by it is processes that the company should put in place. For instance, if you go on the old days when we went on an aeroplane, if you go on an aeroplane and you go to the toilet, the light won't come on till you lock the door. That's overriding human behaviour. So that is what the processes that we can do to try to negate any biases. So processes and systems need to be put in place as well as working on human behaviour.
Fantastic. Okay, I'll open it up for questions now. Tony's got a question. Let's go to Tony in Bournemouth.
Absolutely fascinating, Lynda.
Thank you.
You started by saying brain changes behaviour and vice versa. During the course, and very at the end, and I think you might have even given me the answer in your last iteration there, you mentioned the word companies and you mentioned the word processes. Right at the beginning, what immediately went into my mind when you started was psychometric testing. What you do and with what companies do they actually come to you to, in actual fact, produce the papers that test their employees to see whether they are fit for higher management?
I dealt with a lot with psychometric testing when I was working at a university as a supervisor for dissertation students who were working with HR companies and outsourcing HR companies. There are some psychometric tests that are very well tried and tested. But if you're asking Lynda the person, I have an issue with labelling people in any shape or form unless that label is helpful to them in terms of their own health. If, for instance, if somebody is not doing very well and they don't know what's wrong with them, sometimes giving them a label of what it could be is helpful and useful. If, however, you have got some, I don't know, half a dozen people who are going for a senior manager's job and they are being psychometrically tested, and the decision is based on that alone, I would not agree with it. I would not agree with it at all, because people I said the should word, sorry guys, but it's better that people we see in all sorts of ways, which is why we've got to be so careful, because then all of a sudden we're interviewing them, which is subjective, and then we can have our biases. So we need all of the measures, I think, in order to pick the right person. And
but it would have been one of the tools.
Yeah, I mean, I would never dismiss gut feel either. The enteric nervous system, it's now part of neuroscience that is incredible and moving at a fast rate. You know, the gut instincts, or intuitions rather, not instincts, the gut intuitions, there are 100 million neurons in the gut. Serotonin is in the gut, you know, neurochemicals are in the gut. The gut is a very good source of information. It is an extremely good source of information if you are discussing or considering a topic that you are already very familiar with. If it's a topic that you are not already familiar with, then maybe the gut is not to be relied upon. It's better to employ cognitive resources to actually make some decisions and judgments. But as part of the toolkit, yeah, psychometric testing with the interviewing, with which is subjective, with the gut feel, with looking at the person's CV, with looking at that, you know, and being aware. The last person who did this job was a green Martian with pink spots. I think we need another green Martian with pink spots because they did so well. Is wrong. You know, just because the last person was a certain type doesn't mean to be the next person has to be of a certain type. There are lots of things that should come together when we are talking about employing people or recruiting them or giving them a promotion.
Brilliant, Lynda. Thanks, Tony, for that question. We're nearly out of time, but Lynda, will you stay on once we stop the recording and answer some more questions? That's brilliant. I've always been a great believer in gut feel, and I'm interested to hear you say there's 100 million neurons in the gut. And I do believe that 200 or 300 years ago, people actually thought the brain was in the gut because of that. I don't know if you know whether that was true or not. I'd certainly read that from a good. Yeah,
that's a theory. I have read the theory that once upon a time, a human being was a blob that was stuck to a rock. And then it waited for food to come by sort of in the water so that it could nab it, eat it. But actually, that wasn't very efficient. So the blob decided to get off the rock to survive, and then it could actually become more of a predator. And I believe that is one theory about that was the gut. I don't know if that theory holds water, to be honest with you. I'm sure there are plenty of people who say yes and plenty of people who would argue against it. But what I do know is that the gut has a lot of connections that are incredible in terms of neuroscience.
Fantastic, Lynda. I was when I worked in banking, I must admit I did go a lot on my gut feel as well as the left brain logic and the accounts and everything else. And the twice I ignored my gut feel, I was wrong, and it was wrong to ignore it, which is really, really interesting. Lynda, you've got a book out. I was looking for it on my bookshelf. I must have lent it out to someone and they didn't return it as usual. What's the book called and how can people get hold of it?
I normally have one on my desk and I haven't got it either. Come, school done error.
Pretty lousy at marketing, aren't we?
It's called Your Brain is Boss.
Okay.
And it's an easy read of lots of different aspects of neuroscience and how it can be helpful in terms of psychology and living your life, really.
Brilliant. Well, I'm going to close the formal part of the interview now. Dr. Lynda Shaw, thank you so much for joining me. And we look forward to seeing your success in the future and having you back on the program in the future as well. I'm sure there'll be lots of questions. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Derek. Thanks, everyone.